One of the things about interdisciplinary research is that it requires a really strong awareness of the existence of different disciplinary lenses, and not only that, the existence of different epistemological lenses, so that is different ways of understanding what's true and real about the world. And one of the challenges that any social scientist, particularly a qualitative social scientist, has in a setting like that is to actually explain that very fact to some people who come from a more positivist perspective, who don't necessarily even understand they have a lens or a frame, that don't understand that what they are saying about the world does have very much elements of a story and a narrative about it. And so I find the work of a social scientist in that setting is quite involved, because not only are you doing your own bit, so that's the jigsaw metaphor of interdisciplinarity, you're actually the person that's constructing that jigsaw and helping others to be aware of that, so that you can have the conversations about frames, have the conversation about stories and narratives, to actually then get to the point where you're able to put your knowledge together. So a lot of the work is actually below the surface, if you like, of the specifics content stuff that you're doing. So in the IPCC, I'm yet to see how it goes, but I do know that there's some very strong physical science figures in that team, so we'll be all on a learning journey together. The Rhodes Scholarship covered the Masters and then enabled me to stay on and do a DPhil. So I initially stayed in that field of ecology, I was in the School of Geography and did it in biogeography. But once again, I felt really dissatisfied with just the scientific answers that I was developing through that. So the scientific method, one that I hold dearly, simply leaves out of the picture so much stuff, and particularly the stuff that's causing the destruction of the sorts of ecosystems that I was looking at. So I felt really passionate that I wanted to actually move towards the social science, and one of the great things about geography is you can actually do that within the one discipline. So I moved from biogeography over to cultural geography, and in the end, through a few iterations, my DPhil was actually looking at agricultural education and what we teach young up-and-coming farmers to think about nature and the human-nature relationship and really understand that. And I did that in an ethnographic way that involved me living in a couple of ag colleges to try to really get that feel for what they were learning. I actually ended up becoming vice principal at one of the academic colleges at Melbourne Uni, Janet Clark Hall, one of the smaller ones, where I'd actually been a student myself, and was in charge of all of the tutors and the students about their intellectual journey and teaching them sort of broader scholarship, the skills of scholarship, but also concerns about their broader well-being and their well-rounded nature. And so that was a really involving job. And after a couple of years, I left that and moved into consulting so that I could really try to have that impact on policy, environmental, landscape, rural policy that I was really passionate about. Government was my main client area, a little bit of local government, but primarily state government, especially federal government. So this was all during, as the Millennium Drought started to emerge, etc. And so there were huge concerns, kind of a reawakening, if you like, about the agricultural and the rural sector. And because I also had a very strong footing in climate change, as well as the science and the social science, I actually found myself quite handy, which was nice, to be able to be what they call a knowledge broker between a lot of different groups and really start to, I guess, get some of the big issues on the table, which was kind of my goal, was to get the agenda open to the point where we're not asking what irrigation allocations should be, we're asking, what is the future of irrigation in this region? What's the future of agriculture in this region? Do we need to look beyond that to other alternatives? What do rural communities want? What do rural families want? So those things were things I was able to pursue in that role. I was head of social research in the organisation that I was a medium-sized, about 50 employees. And also, I should mention, during that time, I was lucky enough to become Thinker in Residence, which is the best job title I've ever had. Thinker in Residence at the Birchip Cropping Group, which is a farming organisation up in northwest Victoria. In the consulting world, I always found myself very much the academic in the room, even if that wasn't my formal title, very much drawn to looking to the academic literature, contributing. I made the effort at night to write academic articles and contribute in that way. And I suppose it was after, I guess, a number of years, and when I started to bring those academic connections to the fore, that I really felt that I wanted to be able to ask the hard questions. And it was after a number of frustrations with a couple of projects where I felt I was giving very good answers to really quite silly questions, which is the consultant's burden, if you like. And I really wanted to be able to ask the questions that I thought ought to be asked. And so from that role, it was after a period of maternity leave, I took on an academic network coordinator role, which really didn't have any research component, but allowed me to step towards that. And after a number of years, some teaching, which I'm sort of naturally drawn towards, I started to get my research footing. One of the things that the Primary Industries Adaptation Research Network that I was coordinator of was doing was running masterclasses on climate change adaptation, primarily for farmers, but a whole range of stakeholders within the agricultural world. And that was a fantastic experience for being able to connect with a wide range of people and really remind ourselves what these issues look like from their perspective. And this was incidentally when, my interest in the kind of different stories that people were bringing to this and the different lenses and frames really started to become my primary focus, because it was so clear to me that we were talking about the same thing, but that same thing looked very different from different perspectives. Drought, for example. Is that a symbol of climate change, or is it in actual fact an alternative way of understanding climate relative to climate change? Is it something to worry about? Is it a natural disaster? Or is it simply a business risk? These are the sorts of very value-laden questions that I was dealing with at the time. But the masterclass was primarily for them, and I also taught quite a lot of postgraduate courses for the University of Melbourne. I was lucky to do quite a lot of work with the CSIRO, and particularly they had a group looking at transformational climate change adaptation, being led by Professor Mark Howden, who's now at the ANU. And we were able, through that concept of transformation and transformational adaptation, take something that was, on the one hand, very policy relevant, very applied, but start to tease out and look at some of the bigger assumptions, the bigger epistemological assumptions, intellectual assumptions, but also policy assumptions embedded in existing ways of doing things. And so that was a real bridge for me to move into the much deeper academic world that I'm working in now. Part of that CSIRO work has involved looking at cases of transformational change, and one of the ones that got written up by others within that team was the peanut industry, and there's been a few things around the Ord River scheme as well, which are sort of demonstrations of that. So that certainly stimulated my interest up there. I also had a connection with Charles Darwin University and being an associate at the Institute of Livelihoods and Environment up there as well. So I was always interested in that, but it's primarily through working with colleagues at RMIT on the question of heat, actually, that I sort of came back to that. So we've been looking at some of the climate change projections for up there and looking at the real issues those heat projections pose, particularly for those who live and work outdoors. And so outdoor workers, including agriculturalists, but also construction workers, some of the military as well is very interested in this, and a whole lot of utilities workers, rangers, etc. So my more recent work has been looking at that region and some of the ambitions for it, including the Great Northern Development Plan, through the lens of climate change. So at the moment I'm working on, building up a bit of critical mass around the areas of work that I'm interested in, because I'm actually finding a lot of people are very interested in this. And I think my how can I have 3 feet? 1 foot in science, 1 foot in the world of policy with my consulting background, and then 1 foot very much in social science and critical social science, means that I'm able to sit and position myself in a way that is proving useful to a range of people. And so one of the projects I'm doing at the moment is for the Australian Council for International Agricultural Research. And it's looking at this kind of funny little field called agricultural extension, which has pretty much died away in a lot of areas, but it's actually, if you look closely, simply morphed into different types of things. And there's a whole lot of stuff out there about helping farmers to alter their practices and move and support their livelihoods in different ways. And so I'm doing that looking at the Asia Pacific region. So I've been in Cambodia in the last year looking at that, for example. And through that, I've started to, attract some very, very talented young people to work with me, which has been fantastic. And we're now looking at bringing that back to Australia. So we want to do some work around the regenerative agriculture. So these are efforts of a very varied nature to really, grow agriculture in a new way and not just keep it sustainable, not just keep it resilient, but actually allow it to blossom and to become a bit of a solution for a whole range of problems. So for the International Panel on Climate Change, they are coming up for their 6th assessment report. So every 3 to 4 years they put out a major report consisting of 3 different areas. One around the climate science, one around impacts, vulnerability and adaptation, and one around climate change mitigation. And my focus is on the second one, the impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. And I've been lucky enough to be selected by the federal government to be one of the Australian representatives in that working group. And I'm specifically a lead author in the chapter that's looking at Australasia. And I chose that chapter because it's not theme specific, it's place-based specific. It's obviously a place that I love and know dearly. And will allow me to utilise my abilities to bring together different disciplinary lenses and really to help to synthesise that. So I'm really looking forward to that challenge.